Narrator, deep and suspenseful. Long before Egypt's pyramids rose, before Babylon lit the skies, there was Sumer, the first great civilization on earth. Cities of stone, laws older than the Bible, gods that walked among men. Quick flashes, ziggurats crumbling, clay tablets burning, city ruins buried in sand. Narrator urgent. Then suddenly it all vanished. Entire cities abandoned, temples destroyed, a people erased from history. Beat pause, music drops. Narrator, quietly intense. How did the Sumerians disappear? Was it war? A divine curse? Or something humanity still fears to admit? Cut to black. Text appears. The mystery of the first fall. Narrator, final line, sharp. This isn't just a collapse, it's a warning lost in time. Hey guys, tonight we travel back more than 5,000 years to solve one of history's greatest vanishing acts. The disappearance of the world's first civilization, the Sumerians. Imagine you're standing in a vast, flat, sun-scorched expanse. The air is so hot it feels solid, and a fine, pale dust coats your tongue. In the distance, the heat makes the horizon shimmer and dance, creating phantom lakes on the baked mud. All around you, there's nothing but the whisper of the wind and the oppressive silence of an empty land. But this wasn't always an empty land. You are standing on a graveyard of kings, a testament to the fact that even the most brilliant cultures can be erased by time. Let's be honest, if you were dropped here now with just a water bottle, you probably wouldn't last the afternoon. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And for a bit of fun, post your location and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your feet crunch on the dry, cracked earth. This is southern Iraq, a place the ancient Greeks would later name Mesopotamia, which is a rather beautiful and straightforward name meaning the land between the rivers. The problem is, as you squint into the hazy distance, you can't see any rivers. The legendary Tigris and Euphrates are now just faint, faraway dreams on the horizon, their courses having shifted over the long centuries. What they left behind is this plain of silent dust, a landscape that feels forgotten by both God and man. It's not exactly the lush paradise you might see in a textbook illustration of the Fertile Crescent. This is the deep south, the cradle, the very heartland of where it all began, and it is eerily, profoundly empty. But it's not entirely featureless. As your eyes adjust to the glare, you begin to notice them. Low, unassuming mounds rising from the plain, looking like natural hills. But they aren't natural. These are the tells, the ghosts of ancient cities. Each one is a layered cake of history, a stack of civilizations built one on top of the other, each rising from the mud-brick rubble of the last. It's less of a hill and more of a cosmic laundry pile of forgotten dreams, where every layer of dirt is a century, and every broken pot shard is a forgotten family's dinner. And under the oldest, deepest layers of these tells lies the mystery we're here to explore. Sumer. For thousands of years, nobody even knew the Sumerians existed. When 19th century European adventurers and archaeologists began digging here, they were looking for the Assyrians and Babylonians they'd read about in the Bible. They found their palaces and tablets, but as they dug deeper, they found something else, something older. They unearthed tablets written in a language that was utterly alien, unrelated to any other known tongue. It took decades of painstaking work for scholars to realize they had stumbled upon an entirely separate, more ancient civilization, the true originators. It was like digging for Roman ruins in England and accidentally discovering Atlantis. These were the people who, for all intents and purposes, invented the concept of the city, invented writing, invented the wheel, and even invented the 60-second minute you still use to measure your own life. And then they vanished. Not in a single, fiery explosion like Pompeii, but in a slow, agonizing fade, like a photograph left out in the sun. They disappeared from the pages of history so completely that for 4,000 years, humanity forgot they were ever there. So how does that happen? How does the world's first great culture, a civilization of brilliant innovators, get deleted from the hard drive of human memory? That is the question we're going to answer. But to understand the end, we have to start at the very beginning, with the land itself. The reason civilization sparked to life here of all places is a paradox. This land is naturally harsh. It's a desert with virtually no rainfall, no stone for building, and no native timber. But it had two things in abundance: sunshine and mud. And crucially, it had the wild, untamed power of those two rivers. The secret wasn't the land itself, but what you could do with it if you were clever and desperate enough. Historians still argue whether the people we call Sumerians were the first to arrive, or if they were newcomers who blended with or displaced an earlier people, known as the Ubadians, who had already begun the initial work of digging simple irrigation channels. The evidence is murky, written in layers of silt and prehistoric pottery. It's a reminder that our story doesn't begin on a clean slate, but on a landscape already smudged with the fingerprints of even deeper, more mysterious pasts. And it's here, in this challenging, unpromising terrain, that our ancestors would perform their first great miracle. They would tame the floods, conquer the desert, and build a world out of little more than water and earth. Let's turn back the clock. Way back, before the dust, before the silence. You're standing in that same spot, but now it's 6000 BC. The air is no longer dry but thick with humidity, heavy with the smell of wet earth, blooming water lilies, and decaying reeds. It's a world of green and brown, a sprawling, chaotic wetland that stretches as far as you can see. This isn't a desert yet. It's a vast, untamed swamp, bisected by the glittering, muscular ribbons of the two great rivers. To your west is the Euphrates, the calmer of the two, winding its way slowly toward the Persian Gulf. To your east is the Tigris, faster, more aggressive, and prone to flash floods that can scour the landscape clean in an afternoon. You are one of the early people here, perhaps part of a family that has cautiously ventured down from the northern hills, where farming is rain-fed and predictable. Here, there's no predictable rain. There is only the river, and the river is fickle god. In the spring, when the snows melt in the distant mountains of Anatolia, the rivers swell into terrifying torrents. They don't rise gently and predictably like the Nile in Egypt, which was more like a reliable business partner delivering an annual bonus of fertile silt. No, the Tigris and Euphrates are like a pair of moody, brawling siblings who smash up the house every April. The floodwaters are a churning, muddy chaos, wiping out settlements, drowning livestock, and rearranging the very geography of the plains. But this violent flood is also a gift. When the waters finally recede, they leave behind a blanket of incredibly rich, dark silt. This silt is a miracle fertilizer, packed with nutrients from the mountains. The problem is timing. The floods come too early for the summer growing season, and by the time you want to plant your barley, the sun is a merciless hammer, baking that beautiful silt into a cracked, concrete-hard wasteland. You have a feast of water, followed by a famine of it. It's a classic real estate conundrum. Location, location, location. Even if that location is trying to kill you with either floods or drought 6 months out of the year. This is the challenge that will spark a revolution. You and your neighbors realize you can't defeat the rivers, so you must learn to manage them. You start small. With a simple stone hoe and a reed basket, you dig. You scrape a shallow channel from the riverbank to a nearby patch of low-lying ground. It's back-breaking, tedious work. Your hands are raw. Your back aches constantly. No gym membership required for this level of functional fitness. But then it happens. For the first time, You divert a trickle of the river's power. You watch as the water flows where you command it, turning a patch of dry ground dark and damp. You have bent the world to your will, just a little. This first ditch is the single most important invention in Sumerian history. Everything else will flow from this. Your family's ditch inspires another family. Soon, a network of small channels crisscrosses the land near the riverbank. You learn to build small dams from mud and reeds to create reservoirs, storing the spring floodwater for the brutal summer months. Archaeologists debate whether these first canals were massive, state-organized projects or simply the work of individual families and small communities, slowly linking their efforts together over generations. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, a gradual scaling up of cooperation, driven by the simple, undeniable logic that a bigger canal network feeds more people. Over centuries, this network becomes breathtakingly complex. Canals become the size of small rivers themselves, stretching for miles, complete with junctions, spillways, and gates. This is humanity's first great engineering project, and it utterly transforms the landscape. The chaotic marshland is slowly replaced by a neat, geometric pattern of fields, canals, and dikes. The land is tamed, and with this taming comes a staggering abundance of food. For the first time in human history, you can grow a massive surplus of grain, far more than your immediate family needs to survive. You can grow barley, wheat, dates, and sesame. You can support a population that is growing and growing. This success, however, came with a new kind of anxiety, one deeply embedded in the Sumerian psyche. They knew their entire existence depended on this artificial system, a system that required constant, exhausting maintenance. A neglected canal could silt up. A broken dike could flood hundreds of acres. Their myths reflect this. Their gods were powerful but unpredictable, and humanity was created merely to be their servants, to do the hard work of maintaining creation so the gods could relax. The Epic of Gilgamesh begins with a description of the great city walls, but it also praises the irrigation system that supports it. They knew what their real source of strength was. As a quirky but fascinating echo of this ancient life, the marsh Arabs of southern Iraq, until very recently, lived a life not so different from the earliest settlers, building incredible, cathedral-like houses entirely out of bundled reeds and living on artificial islands in the swamps. They were a living museum of the techniques and materials that gave birth to civilization in this very spot. This ability to create order from watery chaos was the Sumerian superpower. And with that power, and the mountain of surplus barley it produced, they were about to build something the world had never seen before. A city. That mountain of surplus barley changes everything. Its wealth, its power, its security. But it's also a problem. It has to be stored somewhere safe from weather, rats, and rival villages. It has to be managed, counted, and distributed. What you need is a central, fortified storehouse. And what you need to run that storehouse are people who don't farm, specialists, priests to bless the harvest, scribes to count the bushels, and soldiers to guard the walls. Slowly, organically, a settlement begins to grow around the central granary and the shrine that protects it. It swells, drawing people in from the countryside with the promise of food and safety. And over the course of a few centuries, around 3500 BC, this proto-city explodes. It becomes Uruk. As you approach from the green irrigated fields, it's the first thing you see. At first, it's just a smudge on the horizon, but it grows until it fills your entire view. A colossal ring of mud brick walls, miles in circumference, punctuated by defensive towers. The famous hero King Gilgamesh, who would rule Uruk centuries later, would be so proud of these walls that he would command his story to begin with a description of their strength and beauty. They are a statement. They say, "We are here. We are permanent. We are powerful. This isn't a village anymore. This is a fortress, a symbol of a new kind of human power. You pass through one of the massive city gates, and the world transforms. The relative peace of the fields gives way to an overwhelming sensory assault. You are plunged into a bustling, jostling river of humanity. The streets are narrow, unpaved, and labyrinthine, winding between rows of windowless, 1- or 2-story houses made of the same sun-dried mud brick as the walls. The air is thick with the smells of wood smoke, baking bread, roasting meat, human sweat, and the ever-present odor from the livestock being led to market. It's noisy, so noisy. You hear the bleating of sheep, the chatter of 100 conversations in the harsh, agglutinative Sumerian tongue, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a potter at his wheel, and the cries of merchants hawking their wares. This is a city of anywhere from 50,000 to 80,000 people. At this moment in history, it is by far the largest settlement on the planet. It is humanity's first metropolis. For the first time, people are living packed together, cheek by jowl, with thousands of complete strangers. And because of that food surplus, they are doing a dazzling array of different jobs. You see a weaver carrying a brightly dyed bolt of woolen cloth. A metalsmith, his arms thick with muscle, carries a newly forged bronze sickle. A priest in a clean linen skirt walks with an air of untouchable authority. This is the birth of true economic specialization, the great uncoupling of human labor from the soil. This new urban life needed new kinds of stuff. One of the most common and mysterious artifacts found in the ruins of Uruk is something called a bevel-rimmed bowl. Archaeologists have found tens of thousands of them. They are crudely made, mass-produced, and all of a uniform size. They are essentially the ancient world's first disposable styrofoam cups. The leading theory is that these were standardized ration bowls. The temple authorities, who controlled the grain, would hand out daily wages of barley or wheat to legions of laborers in these bowls. It's a fascinating glimpse into a society that was already dealing with mass employment, standardized payments, and, apparently, a desire to not have to do the dishes. You push your way through the throng, following the flow of the crowd, which seems to be moving toward the city's heart. The houses get larger, the streets a little wider, and then you see it. Rising above the flat roofs of the city is an enormous, man-made mountain of brick. This is the ziggurat, a step pyramid that serves as the platform for a temple. Uruk actually had two major temple precincts. One was dedicated to Anu, the god of the sky, topped with a legendary white temple that would have gleamed in the sun. The other, the Inanna precinct, was the true heart of the city, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, the goddess of love, fertility, and, somewhat paradoxically, war. This temple is not just a place of worship. It is the economic and administrative engine of the entire city-state. Its priests and priestesses control the land, oversee the irrigation canals, manage the vast storehouses of grain, and direct the city's major industries, like weaving and pottery. This is a theocracy, where the will of the gods is interpreted and administered by a powerful religious elite. Historians still argue whether Uruk was a true imperial capital that dominated its neighbors through force, or if its immense influence was primarily cultural and economic, a soft power that other towns sought to emulate. Did they send out armies, or did they just have the best gods, the biggest granaries, and the most desirable trade goods? The answer is probably a bit of both. As you stand there in the great temple courtyard, surrounded by the buzz of the world's first city, you feel a sense of both awe and anonymity. You are part of something vast, powerful, and new, a new kind of human superorganism. But you are also just one soul among 80,000. This is the deal humanity made when it invented the city. You trade the freedom and familiarity of the village for the opportunity and protection of the metropolis. And this new urban experiment would require a whole new set of tools to manage its complexity. Living in a city like Uruk, with its tens of thousands of people, creates a whole new set of problems. How do you keep track of everything? How do you remember who delivered 20 sheep to the temple in exchange for 10 sacks of barley? How do you record a royal decree, a legal contract, or a religious hymn? The human memory, which had been sufficient for village life, is suddenly and hopelessly overwhelmed. The temple bureaucracy is drowning in data. They need a technology for memory. They need to invent writing. And so they do. It doesn't happen overnight. It starts simply, with pictures. You are in a temple storeroom, a cool, dark space that smells of old clay and dry grain. A scribe sits at a low table, holding a small, damp pillow of clay in his palm. On the table are piles of tokens, little clay shapes representing goods. A cone for a small measure of grain, a sphere for a larger measure, a cylinder for a goat. To record a transaction, he would take the corresponding tokens, wrap them in a ball of clay called a bulla, and then bake it. If there was a dispute, you could break open the bulla and check the tokens inside. It's a bit like a prehistoric piggy bank, but for accounting. But this system is clumsy. You have to break the record to read it. So, they get a little cleverer. Before sealing the tokens inside, they press the tokens onto the outside of the bulla, leaving impressions. A cone leaves a wedge shape. A sphere leaves a circle. Now you can read the outside of the bulla without breaking it. Then comes the light bulb moment, the spark of genius. Someone, will never know their name, realizes that if you're already making marks on the outside, you don't need the tokens on the inside at all. You can just use a stylus, probably a sharpened reed, to press the same shapes directly into a flat tablet of clay. This is the birth of cuneiform. At first, the signs are pictographic. A drawing of a head means head. A drawing of a stalk of barley means barley. But this is slow, and it's hard to express abstract ideas. How do you draw love or justice? Over time, the pictures become more stylized and abstract. The scribes, for speed and efficiency, start using the wedge-shaped end of the stylus to make impressions rather than drawing lines. This is what gives cuneiform its distinctive look, a series of wedge-shaped marks. The little picture of a head evolves into a complex pattern of wedges. It's a system born from the boring, practical needs of accountants. A mainstream fact that feels almost comically mundane. History's first written texts aren't epic poems or king lists. They are receipts. They are lists of grain, beer, and livestock. The grand saga of human literature begins with bookkeeping, but the real revolution happens when the signs start to represent sounds, not just things. The Sumerian word for head is sag. They realized the wedge pattern for sag can also be used in words that have a sag sound in them. This is the rebus principle, like drawing a picture of a bee and a leaf to represent the word belief. This innovation unlocks the full potential of writing. Now they can record anything they can say. Laws, letters, proverbs, prayers, and stories. The world of human thought, previously ephemeral and fleeting as spoken breath, can now be made permanent. But the Sumerians didn't stop with writing. Their mastery of numbers, born from the same administrative needs, led them to develop a sophisticated base, 60 mathematical system. We still live in the shadow of this system every single day. The reason you have 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour is because of the Sumerians. The 360 degrees in a circle? That's them too. Why base 60? Historians still argue about the exact reason. One popular theory is that it's a highly practical divisible number. You can divide 60 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making it perfect for splitting up goods and rations. Another, more quirky theory suggests it was based on a finger-counting system using the 12 knuckles on one hand and the 5 fingers of the other. 12 times 5 is equal to 60. Whatever the reason, It's a legacy so deeply embedded in our lives, we don't even notice it. And what did they do with all that grain and all that obsessive accounting? They made beer. Lots and lots of beer. Beer was a staple of the Sumerian diet, for everyone from kings to common laborers. It was thick, nutritious, and probably safer to drink than the river water. It was a form of payment, a social lubricant, and a religious offering. They had dozens of different kinds of beer, from dark to light, sweet to bitter. One of the oldest pieces of literature in the world is the hymn to Ninkasi, the Sumerian goddess of brewing. It's not just a hymn, it's a recipe, describing in poetic detail the process of making beer from barley bread. It's a charmingly humanizing detail. These god kings and epic heroes who invented civilization were also just people who really appreciated a good pint after a long day of managing the complexities of their new world. This combination of groundbreaking intellect and everyday relatability is what makes them so compelling. They laid the very foundation of our modern world, one clay tablet, 1/62nd minute, and one pint of beer at a time. With all this newly organized society, this abundance of food, and the ability to write things down, the Sumerians had the luxury of time. Time to think. Time to look up at the sky and wonder, who are we? Why are we here? What's the deal with all this water and dirt? And they answered these questions by constructing an elaborate and fascinating cosmic framework. Their world was populated by a pantheon of powerful, immortal, and frankly, very human-like gods. You are standing now in the great courtyard of the Iana precinct in Uruk, the ziggurat looming over you like a man-made mountain connecting heaven and earth. The air is thick with the smell of incense and roasting sacrificial lamb. The Sumerian universe was, in their view, born from a primeval sea, from which emerged the sky, and the earth key. These were the cosmic parents who then begot a whole host of other deities. The most important of these was Enlil, the god of the air, wind, and storms. He was the enforcer, the one who carried out the decrees of the divine council. He was powerful but also notoriously grumpy and impatient with mortals. Many of the great Sumerian myths, including their version of the Great Flood, portray Enlil as the one who decides to wipe out humanity simply because their noise is disturbing his nap. It's a terrifyingly relatable motive for a deity. Then there was Enki, sometimes called Ea, the god of fresh water, wisdom, and magic. He was the clever one, the trickster, the friend to mankind. In the flood story, it's Enki who secretly warns the Sumerian Noah, a king named Usadra, to build a boat and save himself. He was the god you went to when you needed a clever solution to a problem. And of course, there was Inanna, later known as Ishtar, the goddess of Uruk itself. She was a bundle of contradictions, the goddess of love, beauty, and sensual pleasure, but also the goddess of war, ferocity, and ambition. She was the most dynamic and proactive of the gods, constantly scheming, traveling, and demanding more power. One famous myth, the descent of Inanna, tells the story of her journey into the underworld to challenge the power of her sister, the Queen of the Dead. It's a powerful story of death and rebirth that would echo in later myths across the Near East. This divine world was not some distant, abstract heaven. For the Sumerians, it was right here, interwoven with their daily lives. The gods were believed to literally inhabit the statues housed in the temples. The temple was not just a place of worship, it was the god's actual, physical home on earth. The daily temple rituals were, therefore, a matter of cosmic importance. Priests and priestesses were the servants of the god's household. They woke the god statue in the morning, bathed it, dressed it in fine clothes and jewelry, and served it 2 lavish meals a day. This food, once ritually offered to the deity, was then redistributed to the temple staff and the king, reinforcing the temple's role as the center of the economy. At the top of the human pyramid, Just beneath the gods was the king. The Sumerian word for king was lugal, which literally means big man. The concept of kingship didn't seem to exist at the very beginning. Early cities may have been governed by councils of elders or priests. The mainstream historical view is that the institution of kingship arose from the need for a permanent military leader to command the city's army in the increasingly frequent conflicts with other cities. The Sumerian king list, a remarkable clay document, claims that kingship was handed down from heaven. It then lists a succession of kings who ruled for fantastically long periods. We're talking reigns of 28,800 years before a great flood swept over the land. After the flood, kingship was handed down again, and the reigns become more realistically human. Historians still argue about what to make of this document. Is it pure myth? Or does it contain a kernel of historical truth? A list of real rulers whose reigns were later exaggerated to legendary proportions? The debate is ongoing, but what's clear is the ideology it presents. The king was the chosen intermediary between the gods and humanity. His job was to maintain order, enact justice, and, most importantly, keep the gods happy by building and maintaining their temples. A successful king brought prosperity and peace, which was seen as a sign of divine favor. A disaster, a famine, a plague, a military defeat could be interpreted as a sign that the king had lost the gods' backing. A quirky detail that reveals their worldview is their belief in demons and spirits. The world was full of them. There were demons who caused disease, demons who lurked in the desert, and even a particularly nasty female demon named Lamashtu who preyed on pregnant women and newborn infants. To protect themselves, ordinary people would wear amulets and recite incantations. Archaeologists have found many small clay plaques depicting monstrous figures, which were not objects of worship, but rather protective charms intended to scare away the very evils they depicted. It's like putting up a "Beware of the Dog" sign, but for cosmic terrors. This entire system, gods, kings, priests, and demons, created a powerful social glue. It explained the world, justified the social order, and gave meaning to the struggle of daily life in the land between the rivers. But this divinely sanctioned order was about to be severely tested by a very human problem: greed. The success of the Sumerian model, the city-state built on irrigation and managed by a divine bureaucracy, was so effective that everyone started doing it. The southern Mesopotamian plain, once sparsely populated, became a mosaic of competing urban centers. You have Uruk, the old giant, but now there's also Uar, famous for its wealth and royal tombs. There's Lagash and its eternal rival Umma. There's Nippur, the great religious center, home to the temple of the chief god Enlil, making it something like the Sumerian Vatican. There's Kish, Eridu, and a dozen others. Each city-state controlled its own stretch of territory, its own network of canals, and answered to its own patron deity and its own lugal, or big man. For a time, this seems to have worked. The cities traded with each other, shared a common culture, a common language, and a common pantheon of gods. But you're in a landscape with limited resources. The two most critical resources are land and, even more importantly, water. Your city's canals are your lifeline. What happens when the city upstream from you decides to build a new, massive canal that diverts a significant portion of the water before it ever reaches your fields? Your crops wither. Your people starve. What happens when your city's population grows and you need to cultivate new land, but that land is claimed by the neighboring city? You have a border dispute. And in Sumer, border disputes were not settled by quiet diplomacy. They were settled with bronze spears and crushed skulls. You are now a young farmer, conscripted into the army of your home city, Lagash. You're marching under a scorching sun, your heavy wool kilt scratching your skin, and a bronze helmet pressing down on your head. You carry a long spear and a heavy shield. Ahead of you, Across a disputed field of barley, you can see the army of Umma assembling. This is not a theoretical problem for you. This is terrifyingly real. For over a century, Lagash and Umma have been locked in a bitter, bloody feud over a fertile strip of land called the Guadina, the edge of the plain. The dispute has been passed down from king to king, a miserable inheritance of violence. This conflict is documented in incredible detail on a monument known as the Stele of the Vultures. It's one of history's first detailed war memorials. Carved in limestone, it shows the king of Lagash, Yanatum, leading his troops into battle. One panel shows his soldiers in a tight, disciplined phalanx, their shields locked together and their spears bristling, a formation that predates the famous Greek phalanx by over 1,000 years. Another, more gruesome panel shows the aftermath, vultures flying away with the severed heads of defeated Ummite soldiers in their beaks. This is the stark reality of intercity warfare. It was brutal, personal, and constant. The stele isn't just a record, it's propaganda, a clear message to any other rival city about the price of challenging Lagash. The mainstream historical fact here is the sheer endemic nature of this warfare. For nearly 1,000 years, from roughly 2900 BC to 2350 BC, Sumerian history is a dreary chronicle of city-states fighting each other. One city would gain a temporary advantage, dominating its neighbors for a generation or two under a strong king, only to be overthrown by a new coalition of rivals. It's a political game of whack-a-mole, played with armies. This constant infighting had a profound effect on Sumerian society. It accelerated military technology and tactics. It elevated the role of the king from a manager to a warlord, and it drained the wealth and manpower of the entire region. They were caught in a trap of their own making. The very system that created their prosperity also created the conditions for endless, self-destructive conflict. One of the more quirky and debated aspects of this period is the role of diplomacy. It wasn't all just mindless bashing. We have clay tablets that are essentially letters between kings, full of boasts, threats, and sometimes attempts at negotiation. They would often try to resolve disputes by appealing to a third party, usually the priests of the high god Enlil in the neutral city of Nippur. The priests would act as arbitrators, consulting ancient records and divine omens to determine the rightful owner of a disputed canal or field. This was an early attempt at international law. The problem was, there was no enforcement mechanism. If the losing city didn't like the verdict, they could simply ignore it and go back to fighting. Historians still argue about how effective this system of arbitration really was. Was it a genuine effort to maintain peace? Or was it just a political ritual to justify a war you already intended to fight? The tragedy of it all is that while the Sumerian cities were busy fighting each other, they were blind to a greater threat gathering on their northern border. For centuries, a different group of people had been living just to the north of Sumer, in the land of Akkad. These were the Akkadians. They spoke a completely different language, a Semitic tongue, related to modern Hebrew and Arabic. They had largely absorbed Sumerian culture, worshipped the same gods, though giving them Akkadian names, and used the same cuneiform script. For a long time, they were the other, the northern neighbors, sometimes allies, sometimes rivals, but always distinct. They were living side by side with the Sumerians, watching them, learning from them, and waiting. And one day, a man of humble origins would rise up among the Akkadians, a man who had a new, terrifyingly simple idea. Instead of just defeating the other cities, why not conquer all of them permanently? His name was Sargon, and he was about to bring the age of the squabbling city-states to a sudden and violent end. The world of constant, predictable warfare between rival Sumerian cities is about to be shattered. The threat doesn't come from a traditional power like Uruk or Uar. It comes from the north, from the city of Kish, and from a man who, by all accounts, should never have been king. His name is Sargon, and his origin story is the stuff of legend, so powerful that it will be echoed in the stories of Moses and other future heroes. According to the legend, Sargon was the illegitimate son of a high priestess. To hide her shame, she placed him in a basket woven from reeds, sealed it with pitch, and set it adrift on the Euphrates River. He was found and rescued by a humble gardener named Aki, who raised him as his own son. As a young man, he gets a job as the cupbearer to the king of Kish, Uarzababa. This wasn't just a servant role. The cupbearer was a position of immense trust, a high-ranking official who was always by the king's side. The legend gets a bit murky here, full of omens and dreams that frighten the king into seeing Sargon as a threat. Uarzababa tries to have Sargon killed, but Sargon, probably through a combination of charisma, cunning, and ruthless ambition, turns the tables. He overthrows Uarzababa and seizes the throne of Kish for himself. He is no longer Sargon the gardener's boy. He is Sargon of Akkad, and he has bigger plans than just ruling one city. You are a soldier in the army of Lugal-Zagizi, the powerful king of Umma. Lugal-Zagizi is the closest thing Sumer has to a unifying figure. Through a series of brilliant military campaigns, he has finally defeated his city's hated rival, Lagash, and has forced most of the other Sumerian cities into a loose federation under his control. He calls himself King of Uruk and King of the land. He is at the pinnacle of his power. He hears news of this upstart Sargon, who has seized power in Kish, but he likely isn't too worried. It's just another big man to deal with, another challenger in the age-old game. He is wrong. Sargon marches south with a new kind of army. It's not just a city militia called up for a seasonal campaign. He has created a professional, standing army of 5,400 soldiers who eat with him daily. This is a corps of loyal, well-trained, full-time warriors. He battles Lugal-Zagizi and his coalition of Sumerian cities in a massive, decisive confrontation, and Sargon wins. He utterly crushes the Sumerian forces, but he doesn't stop there. He captures Lugal-Zagizi, puts him in a dog collar, and marches him to the holy city of Nippur to be publicly humiliated at the gate of the great god Enlil. It's a devastating political statement. The old order is over. Sargon then begins a lightning campaign of conquest that is unlike anything the Sumerians have ever seen. He isn't just trying to establish dominance. He is aiming for total subjugation. He marches his army down the length of Mesopotamia, all the way to the Persian Gulf. A famous inscription claims he washed his weapons in the sea to symbolize the totality of his victory. He systematically conquers every single Sumerian city-state. Uruk, Uar, Lagash, Umma. All of them fall. And to ensure they stay fallen, he does something radical. He tears down their defensive walls. A city without walls is not a threat, it's a hostage. This is a mainstream historical fact that marks a fundamental shift in political reality, the end of the independent city-state and the beginning of the empire. He establishes a new capital city, Akkad, or Agade. Frustratingly for archaeologists, the precise location of this legendary city has never been found. It remains one of history's great lost capitals, hidden somewhere beneath the dust of modern Iraq. From this central location, he rules his new, unified kingdom. He is no longer just a Lugal. He is Sarakinu, the true king, the king of Sumer and Akkad. He has forged the world's first true empire. The secret to Sargon's military success is a subject of intense scholarly debate. Was it superior tactics? The loyalty of his professional army? Or was it a new weapon? Sargon's army was one of the first major forces to make widespread use of a new technology, the composite bow. Made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, it was far more powerful and had a much greater range than the simple wooden bows the Sumerians had been using. An army that can rain death upon its enemies from a distance before the spear clash even begins has a massive advantage. This technological edge, combined with Sargon's strategic genius, may have been the key that unlocked Mesopotamia. A quirky, more personal detail about Sargon is how he managed his new, sprawling empire. He couldn't be everywhere at once, so he installed trusted Akkadian governors in the conquered Sumerian cities to enforce his will. But his most brilliant move was appointing his own daughter, Enheduanna, as the high priestess of the moon god Nana in the powerful southern city of Ur. This was a masterstroke. It placed a loyal family member in control of one of the most important religious and economic institutions in the Sumerian heartland. Enheduanna was more than just a political appointee. She was a brilliant poet and theologian in her own right. Astonishingly, we still have her writings. She is the first author in all of human history whose name we know. Her hymns to the goddess Inanna are masterpieces of ancient literature, blending her Akkadian perspective with deep respect for Sumerian traditions. Through her, Sargon didn't just conquer Sumer. He began a process of cultural fusion from the very top. The arrival of the Akkadians was a shock, a storm that swept away the old world. But what replaced it was something new, something bigger, and something that would change the destiny of Sumer forever. The dust has settled from Sargon's conquest. The walls of the great Sumerian cities are rubble. Akkadian governors sit in the palaces where Sumerian kings once ruled. You are now living in a new world, the Akkadian Empire. For the average Sumerian farmer or craftsman, life probably didn't change dramatically overnight. You still tilled your fields, paid your taxes, now to a governor from Akkad instead of a priest from Ur, and prayed to the same gods. But for the old ruling class, the priests, the nobles, the scribal families who had run things for centuries, it was a seismic shift. Their power was broken. Your scribe in the city of Uruk, trained in the old Sumerian traditions. Your family has served the Eanna temple for generations. Now, you have a new boss, an Akkadian, who speaks Sumerian with the harsh, guttural accent. Your job is now to write inscriptions glorifying Sargon, the man who conquered your home. The official language of the administration is now Akkadian. While Sumerian is still used, especially in religious texts, it is slowly being relegated to the status of a classical or liturgical language, a bit like Latin in the medieval Catholic Church. You have to be bilingual to get ahead. The Akkadian rulers were clever. They didn't try to erase Sumerian culture. Instead, they adopted it, adapted it, and fused it with their own Semitic traditions. This process is called syncretism. They worshipped the Sumerian gods, but gave them Akkadian names. The Sumerian sky god and became the Akkadian Anu. The wise god Enki became Ea. The greatest fusion was with the goddess Inanna. The Akkadians identified her with their own war goddess, Ishtar, amplifying her fierce, ambitious, and warlike aspects. The gentleish Sumerian goddess of love and Uruk now becomes the fearsome queen of heaven, a patron deity for an empire built on military might. This is a clear example of how culture shifts to reflect new political realities. The Akkadian kings, especially Sargon and his grandson, the formidable Naram-Sin, also introduced a new ideology of kingship. The old Sumerian Lugal was the steward of the city's god, a servant of the divine. The Akkadian kings took it a step further. Naram-Sin was the first Mesopotamian king to declare himself a god in his own lifetime. On his famous victory stele, he is depicted as a towering, muscular figure wearing a horned helmet, a symbol previously reserved only for deities. He is literally trampling his enemies underfoot as he ascends a mountain to the heavens. The message is unambiguous. The king is not just the god's chosen one. He is a god. This was a profound break from Sumerian tradition and would have been seen as shocking hubris by many. This new empire wasn't just a political entity. It was a commercial one. Sargon and his successors secured and expanded trade routes that stretched from the silver mines of Anatolia, modern Turkey, to the copper mines of Oman, which they called Magan, and all the way to the Indus Valley civilization, Malaha, in modern-day Pakistan. A mainstream historical fact confirmed by archaeology is the discovery of Akkadian-period cylinder seals in Indus Valley sites and Indus Valley seals and weights in Mesopotamian cities. This was a truly international age of trade, policed by Akkadian power. The goods flowing into the capital at Akkad would have been staggering: gold, silver, copper, tin, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, and cedarwood from Lebanon. The empire was an economic engine, funneling the wealth of the known world into its heartland. Life within this vast, multicultural empire must have been a complex mix of opportunity and oppression. If you were a merchant willing to play by the new rules, you could get very rich. If you were an ambitious young man, you could join the Akkadian army and see the world. But if you were a proud Sumerian citizen of a city like Uar or Uruk, you were living under foreign occupation. Rebellions were frequent. Sargon's own sons and grandsons had to constantly put down massive revolts from the Sumerian cities, who longed for their old independence. Naram-Sin claimed to have faced a great rebellion of all the major Sumerian cities and defeated them all. Historians still debate the nature of Akkadian rule. Was it a brutal military occupation that exploited the Sumerian south for the benefit of the Akkadian north? Or was it a more integrated system that brought peace, stability, and unprecedented economic prosperity to the entire region, ending the centuries of destructive infighting between the city-states? The truth, as is often the case, is likely a messy combination of both. It was a golden age of trade and power, but it was a golden age built on conquest and maintained by force. A quirky and telling artifact from this period is the change in art. Sumerian art was often formal, serene, and focused on religious scenes. Akkadian art is full of life, realism, and dynamic energy. The bronze head of an Akkadian ruler, long thought to be Sargon himself, found at Nineveh is a masterpiece of naturalism and royal authority. A portrait of an individual, not just an icon. It shows a powerful, confident man with an elaborate hairstyle and a commanding gaze. Unfortunately, at some point in antiquity, the statue was deliberately mutilated. The eyes were gouged out, and the ears and nose were cut off. This was a symbolic act of political vandalism, a way for a later conqueror to kill the memory and power of the Akkadian king. It's a silent, bronze testament to the fact that while the Akkadians had unified Sumer, they had not won all of its people's hearts. This simmering resentment, combined with the king's divine pretensions, was creating a dangerous pressure cooker. The empire looked invincible, but its foundations were trembling. The Akkadian Empire, for all its power and glory, lasted only about 150 years. It was a brilliant flash in the pan of history, and its collapse was as dramatic as its rise. The end came not from one single cause, but from a perfect storm of internal rebellion, external invasion, and perhaps the wrath of the gods themselves, or at least, the wrath of their priests. You are living in the reign of Shar-Kali-Shari, the son of the god-king Naram-Sin. The empire he has inherited is already fraying at the edges. The vast trade network is breaking down. Rebellions are flaring up again in the Sumerian south with renewed intensity. The king seems to spend his entire reign rushing from one fire to the next, trying to hold his grandfather's vast creation together. The divine arrogance of Naram-Sin has left a bitter aftertaste. The old Sumerian religious establishment, centered in the holy city of Nippur, never truly accepted the idea of a living god-king. This hubris, they whispered, had angered the great god Enlil. And then, from the Zagros Mountains to the east, a new threat emerges. They are the Gutians. The Sumerian and Akkadian record described them as a plague, a barbaric and venomous people. They are portrayed as uncivilized highlanders who don't know how to farm, who don't respect the gods, and who live like animals. They have the intelligence of a dog, the appearance of a monkey. One text laments, "This is almost certainly propaganda, the view of a sophisticated urban culture looking down on nomadic pastoralists." But the Gutians were fierce and effective warriors. They began launching raids into the Mesopotamian plain, disrupting agriculture, sacking towns, and making travel unsafe. They were a destabilizing force that the overstretched Akkadian army struggled to contain. The story of the empire's fall is immortalized in a remarkable piece of Sumerian literature called The Curse of Akkad. It's a powerful work of political propaganda, written after the collapse, that seeks to explain why it all went wrong. The poem claims that Naram-Sin, in a fit of rage and impatience because the gods wouldn't give him a clear sign to rebuild a temple, committed the ultimate act of sacrilege. He marched his army to the holy city of Nippur and destroyed the Ikur, the temple of Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon. He put his spades into its roots, his axes into its foundations. This was a crime beyond all measure. In response, the enraged Enlil unleashes a terrible vengeance. He summons the Gutians from the mountains, a people who know no inhibition, to descend upon the land and destroy the Akkadian Empire. The poem paints a vivid, heartbreaking picture of the collapse. The capital, Akkad, is utterly destroyed, its streets filled with silence, and its fields growing nothing but weeds. Trade ceases. The once mighty canals silt up. Starvation grips the cities. For the first time since cities were built and founded, the great agricultural tracts produced no grain. The cloud of dust did not settle. It is a total societal breakdown. The great Akkadian Empire, built by Sargon, collapses into chaos. This is the literary explanation. For a long time, historians took it as a mythologized but broadly accurate account. Internal weakness, followed by barbarian invasion, led to collapse. This is a classic historical narrative, seen in the fall of Rome and many other empires. The Gutian invasion is a mainstream historical fact, mentioned in many texts. They ruled over parts of southern Mesopotamia for perhaps a century, a period often described as a dark age. Though recent scholarship suggests their control was likely not as total or as devastating as the Sumerian scribes made it out to be. But there's another layer to this story, a modern scientific theory that has gained significant traction. The Curse of Akkad speaks of a time when the fields grew no grain and the clouds of dust never settled. What if that wasn't just poetic license? What if it was a description of a real climate event? Around 2200 BC, or 4.2 thousand years ago, paleoclimatologists have found evidence from ice cores, lake sediments, and tree rings from around the globe for a sudden, severe, and long-lasting drought event. This is known as the 4.2 kilo-year event. The theory is that a dramatic shift in monsoon patterns led to a centuries-long period of drastically reduced rainfall across the Middle East. Historians still argue intensely about the impact of this event. Was it the primary cause of the Akkadian collapse, or just an aggravating factor? Could the empire have survived the Gutians if its agricultural base hadn't been crumbling beneath its feet from an unprecedented drought? In a civilization utterly dependent on river flow and canal irrigation, a sharp drop in the water levels of the Tigris and Euphrates would be catastrophic. It would lead to widespread crop failure, famine, and social unrest, making the empire vulnerable to both internal revolt and external attack. It's possible the Gutians weren't a cause of the collapse, but a symptom of it. People from the now arid mountains being forced down onto the plains in a desperate search for food and water. A quirky detail that hints at this environmental catastrophe comes from archaeological surveys of the region. They show that around this time, there was a massive abandonment of settlements in the northern part of Mesopotamia, the Akkadian heartland, which was more dependent on rainfall. At the same time, There was a surge in population in the far south, as people fled the drought-stricken north and moved towards the marshlands and the more reliable outlets of the rivers. It was a massive wave of climate refugees. The first great empire in history may have been brought down not just by barbarian hordes or the curse of an angry god, but by something far more impersonal and far more terrifying: climate change. The memory of this collapse, this first great societal trauma, would linger for centuries, and it would pave the way for the last, glorious revival of Sumerian power. The Gutian period, that so-called Dark Age, eventually comes to an end. It wasn't a sudden event, but a gradual fading of their power. The Gutians, being more of a loose confederation of tribes than a structured state, never managed to build a lasting administration. They were more like a century-long raid than a true empire. The old Sumerian cities of the south, though weakened, had kept their cultural identity and their institutions alive, and they were waiting for a chance to reassert themselves. That chance comes in the form of a man named Utu-Ingal, the king of Uruk, the ancient city of Gilgamesh. Around 2100 BC, he raises a rebellion against the Gutian king, Tirakin. He rallies the Sumerian cities behind him, defeats the Gutian army, and captures their king. A triumphant inscription describes how Utu-Ingal placed his foot on Tirakin's neck, a classic ancient gesture of total victory. He declares himself king of Sumer and Akkad, reclaiming the title of Sargon, but this time for a Sumerian. The foreigners have been expelled. Sumer is free. Utu-Ingal's reign, however, is short-lived. The real power behind the Sumerian resurgence lies with one of his own governors, a man named Ur-Nammu, who was in charge of the great southern city of Ur, through means that are not entirely clear. It may have been a peaceful transfer of power or a more forceful usurpation. Ur-Nammu takes over the kingship from Utu-Ingal, and it is Ur-Nammu who will become the architect of the great Sumerian Renaissance. He establishes a new dynasty, known to history as the Third Dynasty of Ur, or Ur-3. This will be the last time an independent Sumerian-speaking state will rule Mesopotamia, and it will be one of its most brilliant periods. You are now in the city of Ur, which has replaced Akkad and Uruk as the capital of the known world. The city is undergoing a massive construction boom. Ur-Nammu is a builder king, and his crowning achievement rises at the heart of the city. He has rebuilt the old temple precinct on a monumental scale. At its center is the great ziggurat of Ur. Unlike the older, crumbling ziggurats, this one is a masterpiece of engineering. It has a solid core of mud brick, but its entire exterior is encased in a thick layer of waterproof baked bricks, set in bitumen mortar. This is an incredibly expensive and labor-intensive process, designed to protect the structure from the elements forever. 3 massive staircases converge on a gatehouse at the first level, from which another flight of stairs would have led to the temple shrine at its summit. It was a statement of power, piety, and permanence. It still stands today, partially reconstructed, as the most iconic monument of Sumerian civilization. That Ur-Nammu's greatest and most lasting achievement, however, was not made of brick, but of words. He issued what is arguably the world's first comprehensive law code. While fragments of earlier laws exist, the code of Ur-Nammu is the oldest, one we have preserved on a clay tablet. It predates the more famous Code of Hammurabi by about 3 centuries, and it's a fascinating document. You can see a society grappling with concepts of justice and fairness. The code begins with a prologue where Ur-Nammu declares his divine mandate to establish justice in the land and protect the weak from the strong. "I did not deliver the orphan to the rich," he boasts, "nor the widow to the mighty." The laws themselves are surprisingly nuanced. Unlike Hammurabi's later eye for an eye principle, Ur-Nammu's code mostly prescribes financial penalties for offenses. If a man knocks out another man's tooth, he shall pay 2 shekels of silver. If he cuts off his foot, 10 shekels. It deals with everything from divorce and inheritance to agricultural disputes and accusations of witchcraft. Historians still debate the purpose of these law codes. Were they actual, binding legislation that judges consulted in court? Or were they more like idealized royal manifestos, a king's public declaration of what he considered to be justice, meant to show what a wise and righteous ruler he was? Either way, it's a landmark in the history of human governance. Under Uarnemu and his son, the brilliant administrator Shulgi, who ruled for a remarkable 48 years, the UR3 Empire reached its zenith. It was a highly centralized, bureaucratic state that controlled a territory roughly the size of the old Akkadian Empire. They redug the ancient canals, reclaimed agricultural land, and promoted trade. The kingdom was prosperous and, for a time, secure. A quirky, almost obsessive feature of this period was its bureaucracy. The UR3 state was pathologically obsessed with record-keeping. Archaeologists have unearthed over 100,000 cuneiform tablets from this short period of about a century, and they are almost all administrative texts, meticulous records of everything. They tracked every single sheep, every bushel of barley, every plot of land. We have records for the amount of feed given to the king's horses, receipts for single wooden sandals, and memos tracking the output of individual weavers in state-run workshops. It was a command economy run by an army of scribes. This incredible trove of data gives us an unprecedented, if fantastically boring, window into the daily workings of an ancient state. It's a historian's dream and a novelist's nightmare. This Sumerian Renaissance was a golden evening for their culture. Literature flourished. Scribes copied and edited the ancient myths and epic poems, including the first unified versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh. They were consciously looking back to their own glorious past, preserving their heritage. But even as the ziggurat of Ur rose towards the heavens, and the scribes tallied their accounts, a slow, insidious poison was seeping into the very soil that had given them life. They had rebuilt the Sumerian world, but they had also inherited its fatal flaw, an ecological time bomb that had been ticking for 1,000 years. And it was about to go off. The great ziggurat of Ur gleams under the Mesopotamian sun. The granaries are full. The scribes are busy counting every last goat. On the surface, the empire of UR3 looks like the triumphant and permanent rebirth of Sumerian power. But if you walk away from the grand temples and bustling city streets, out into the fields that are the true source of this wealth, you'll see the signs of a creeping sickness. A sickness that is literally written on the earth. You're standing beside a barley field near the city of Girsu, in the heart of the Sumerian agricultural plain. The stalks are green, but as you look closer at the ground between them, you see a faint, white crust, like a dusting of frost on a winter morning. But it isn't frost. It's salt. You touch it, and it feels gritty. You taste it, and it's the bitter tang of the sea. Year by year, this white poison is spreading, climbing higher up the stalks of grain, choking the life from the soil. This is the catastrophic, unintended consequence of the Sumerians' greatest invention, irrigation. For millennia, they had been diverting the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates to water their crops. This river water, while appearing fresh, carries a small but significant amount of dissolved mineral salts, picked up as it flows over the land. In a normal river system, this salt is eventually washed out to sea. But in the flat, semi-arid landscape of southern Mesopotamia, it's a different story. You bring the water into your fields through canals. The sun, relentless hammer in the summer sky, beats down on the irrigated land. A huge amount of that water evaporates, leaving the salt behind in the topsoil. This is a problem, but it's made much worse by another factor, the water table. The plains of Sumer are very flat, and drainage is poor. Decades and centuries of continuous irrigation caused the underground water table to rise, bringing more ancient, saline groundwater closer to the surface. As this salty water gets near the surface, it too is drawn up by the sun's heat through capillary action, evaporating and leaving yet another layer of salt. The Sumerians were, in essence, slowly and unintentionally recreating the salty ocean in their own fields. This process is called soil salinization, and it is a slow-motion ecological disaster. For many centuries, the problem was manageable, but by the time of the Third Dynasty of UR, it had reached a crisis point. We can track this disaster in the meticulous records kept by the Sumerian scribes themselves. The earliest records from around 3500 BC show that farmers in southern Mesopotamia grew roughly equal amounts of wheat and barley. This is a key historical fact. Wheat is a highly desirable crop, but it is very sensitive to salt in the soil. Barley, on the other hand, is much more salt-tolerant. As you track the temple records forward through the centuries, you see a grim, undeniable trend. The proportion of wheat being harvested steadily declines. By 2500 BC, wheat accounts for only about 15% of the crop in the south. By 2100 BC, the time of UR3, wheat cultivation in the southern part of the plain has been almost completely abandoned. They are now growing almost nothing but barley, and even the hardy barley is struggling. Crop yields, which were once spectacularly high, begin to plummet. The scribes record harvests that are a third, and then a half, of what they were in the early days. The land is dying. Historians and environmental scientists still debate the exact timeline and the extent to which the Sumerians understood what was happening. Did they connect the rising salt levels with their irrigation practices? The evidence suggests they did, at least partially. We have texts that describe fields as being salt-eaten. They even developed some mitigation strategies. They would sometimes try to flush the fields with fresh water to wash the salt away, or leave fields fallow for several years to let the natural vegetation help lower the water table. A quirky and rather desperate farming technique they used was to plant the seeds on the sides of the furrows rather than at the bottom, to try and keep the roots above the most concentrated saline water. But these were temporary fixes, like putting a bandage on a severed artery. They were fighting a fundamental law of hydrology in a flat, hot, poorly drained landscape. This ecological crisis created immense pressure on the UR3 state, the heartland of Sumer. The very source of its original power and wealth was becoming a barren wasteland. The government had to shift the center of agricultural production further north, to the areas around Kish and Babylon, where the salinization problem was less severe. This meant the political and economic center of gravity in Mesopotamia was beginning to drift away from the ancient Sumerian cities. It was a geographic power shift driven by soil chemistry. This poisoned earth had profound social consequences. As yields fell, it became harder and harder to produce the massive agricultural surplus needed to feed the army, the bureaucrats, the priests, and the artisans. The state's revenues were shrinking. The complex, top-heavy bureaucracy of UR, with its obsessive need to count every last grain, was becoming an unsustainable burden on a failing agricultural system. The empire looked strong on the outside, but its economic foundations were being eaten away from within by billions of tiny salt crystals. The great Sumerian civilization, which had been built by mastering water, was now being slowly destroyed by it. This internal weakness, this environmental sickness, made them dangerously vulnerable to new pressures from the outside. The land was weeping salt, and new peoples were gathering on the borders. The kingdom of UR3, under the long and prosperous reign of King Shulgi, appeared to be a perfectly tuned machine. It was a triumph of centralization, a state managed with an almost neurotic level of precision. But this beautiful, intricate machine was also incredibly rigid and breathtakingly expensive to run. The sheer weight of its own administration was becoming a critical problem, especially as the salty soil began to yield less and less grain. Imagine you are a minor functionary, a scribe named Puzamama, working in a government office in the provincial town of Puzrishdagon. Your entire life is governed by clay and stylus. Your job, day in and day out, is to record the movement of livestock. A delivery of 10 sheep arrives from a nearby village, destined for the temple sacrifice. You must note the date, the name of the herder, the exact number and type of animal, and their intended purpose. You then issue a clay tablet as a receipt. That tablet is then filed. Another scribe records that the 10 sheep have been added to the temple's holdings. When the sheep are issued to the temple kitchen, another tablet is written. When the wool is sheared, its weight is recorded. When the skins are sent to a leatherworker, another tablet. It is a system of total information awareness, but for goats. This is the mainstream historical image of the UR3 state, a bureaucracy of almost suffocating completeness. The king at the center in UR was, in theory, the owner of all the land. A huge portion of the population worked directly for the state in vast agricultural or industrial complexes, enormous workshops with hundreds of weavers, or massive state-run farms, worked by regiments of laborers. These workers were paid in rations of barley, oil, and wool, all of which were meticulously recorded. This system allowed the king to mobilize vast resources for his building projects, like the Great Ziggurat, and to support a large standing army. But it was also incredibly fragile. It depended on the absolute obedience of its provincial governors and the unwavering efficiency of its thousands of scribes. King Shulgi, a true administrative genius, managed to keep it all running. He standardized weights and measures across the kingdom. He reformed the scribal schools to produce legions of loyal, uniformly trained bureaucrats. He even established a system of royal messengers, a kind of pony express with way stations stocked with supplies, so that he could get reports from and send orders to the far corners of his kingdom with incredible speed. One boastful text claims he once ran from the northern city of Nippur to his capital at UR and back in a single day, a round trip of nearly 200 miles, just to celebrate a religious festival in both cities. While this is almost certainly an exaggeration, it captures the ethos of the man, a tireless micromanager obsessed with efficiency and control. However, historians still debate the true nature of this bureaucratic state. Was it really as totalitarian and centrally controlled as the official records suggest? Or is our view skewed because the only documents that survive are the state's own administrative records? This is a classic historical problem. We see the kingdom through the eyes of its accountants. It's possible that a thriving private economy of merchants, farmers, and entrepreneurs existed alongside the state-controlled sector, an economy that simply wasn't documented with the same obsessive care. We get small hints of this from legal documents and contracts that deal with private sales of houses and fields. The reality was likely a hybrid system, a state-dominated economy that still left some room for private enterprise on the margins. Point one of the quirky and very humanizing results of this scribal culture is that we have access to their homework. Archaeologists have found thousands of Aduba tablets, which means tablet house, the Sumerian word for school. These tablets show the exercises of young boys learning to become scribes. We see them practicing their ABCs, or rather, their wedge patterns, memorizing long lists of words for trees, animals, and professions. We see them doing math problems. And we also see their complaints. We have essays about school life that are instantly relatable. Students complaining about their difficult teachers, getting caned for sloppy handwriting or talking in class, and trying to convince their fathers to bribe the teacher with a good meal and a bottle of beer to get better grades. It's a wonderfully grounding reminder that behind this monolithic bureaucracy were just kids, struggling through their lessons, dreaming of graduation, but this complex system was under immense strain. The falling agricultural yields meant the state had to squeeze the provinces harder and harder for resources. The cost of the army, needed to defend the long frontiers of the empire, was enormous. The bureaucracy itself consumed a huge portion of the state's revenue. It was a vicious cycle. As the economy weakened, the state needed more control to extract resources, which in turn required more bureaucrats, which cost more money. The empire was becoming top-heavy, brittle, and dangerously overextended. And as the central authority in UR began to show signs of weakness, two groups of outsiders, one slowly trickling in, the other gathering like a storm cloud, saw an opportunity. The carefully constructed house of cards built by Ur-Nammu and Shulgi was about to face a strong wind. While the scribes of UR are busy balancing their books and the land is growing sick with salt, a new group of people is appearing on the scene. They don't arrive in a single, thunderous invasion like the Gudians. Their arrival is more like a slow, steady infiltration, a rising tide of humanity that will fundamentally change the cultural and political landscape of Mesopotamia forever. They are the Amorites. To the Sumerians and Akkadians in their bustling cities, the Amorites are Westerners. The Sumerian word for them is Marchtiu, which is also their word for the West. They come from the arid plains and hills of what is now Syria and the Jordanian desert. They are a Semitic-speaking people, pastoral nomads whose livelihood revolves around herds of sheep and goats. From the perspective of a sophisticated urbanite in UR, the Amorites are the ultimate outsiders, rustic country bumpkins. One Sumerian text describes a stereotypical Amorite in a way that drips with condescension. He is a tent dweller, buffeted by wind and rain, who digs up truffles in the foothills, who does not know how to bend the knee in submission, who eats raw meat, who has no house during his lifetime, and who is not buried in a tomb after his death. For centuries, the Amorites had lived on the fringes of Mesopotamian civilization, sometimes trading with the cities, sometimes raiding them. During the stable and powerful reigns of Ur-Nammu and Shulgi, the frontier was secure. Shulgi even built a massive wall, over 170 miles long, between the Tigris and Euphrates north of the capital, specifically to keep the Tidnum, a tribe of Amorites, at a distance. This is a major historical fact, a clear indication that the UR Third Kings saw the Amorites as a significant and persistent threat. It's the ancient equivalent of building a border wall to control immigration. But walls are only as strong as the empire that mans them. As the UR3 state began to weaken from its internal problems, the failing agriculture, and the crushing weight of its own bureaucracy, it became harder and harder to patrol the long frontier. The wall was breached, or more likely, simply bypassed. The Amorite migration began to accelerate. They weren't coming as a conquering army, at least not at first. They came as families and clans, seeking grazing land for their flocks, seeking work as mercenaries in the armies of the Sumerian cities, or simply fleeing the harshness of the desert for the relative abundance of the irrigated plains. You are governor of a small town on the western edge of the empire under one of Shulgi's less effective successors. Your scouts report Amorite tents pitched just beyond the state-owned fields. A few weeks later, they are grazing their sheep on the fallow land. You don't have enough soldiers to drive them off. The king in UR sends angry letters demanding you expel the intruders, but he doesn't send any troops to help. So you make a deal. You let them stay in exchange for a tax paid in sheep, and you hire some of their young men as guards. Slowly, peacefully, the Amorites are becoming part of the landscape. They are settling down, adopting Mesopotamian customs, taking Akkadian and Sumerian names, and even rising to positions of local authority. This slow, steady demographic shift is a huge point of debate among historians. Was the Amorite problem a violent invasion, or was it a mostly peaceful migration that was later characterized as violent by the scribes of a falling empire looking for someone to blame? The evidence seems to point to a combination of both. There were certainly violent clashes, raids, and battles, but the more significant, long-term impact was this gradual process of infiltration and assimilation. The Amorites were not trying to destroy Mesopotamian civilization. They wanted to become part of it, and eventually, to lead it. We see this happening in the official records. In the later years of the UR3 dynasty, Amorite names start appearing more and more frequently in the administrative texts. We see them as soldiers, as merchants, and eventually, as high-ranking officials. A quirky and revealing example is a man named Ishbaera. He was an official of the last king of Ur-Ibisin. He was not a native Sumerian or Akkadian. He was an Amorite who had risen high in the imperial service. The king entrusted him with the vital task of procuring grain from the northern cities of Isin and Kazalu and shipping it downriver to the starving capital of Ur. But Ishbaera was ambitious. Seeing the king's weakness and the chaos gripping the kingdom, he saw his chance. Instead of sending the grain to Ur, he kept it for himself. He used it to feed his own army and declared the city of Isin an independent kingdom under his own rule. He then began sending letters to the king, Ibisin, that are masterclass in passive-aggressive diplomacy. He respectfully calls the king my father, but then makes excuses for why he can't send the grain and starts demanding control over more cities. It was a classic stab in the back, a betrayal from within by one of the very people the system had elevated. Ishbaera's new kingdom of Isin became a magnet for other Amorite chiefs and adventurers. He had shown the way. The UR3 empire, already hollowed out from within by its ecological and bureaucratic problems, was now being carved up by ambitious Amorite warlords. The great, centralized state was shattering into a mosaic of smaller kingdoms, many of them now ruled by men of Amorite descent. The Sumerian heartland was in chaos. The last king of Ur-Ibisin was now isolated in his capital, a king in name only, watching his empire disintegrate around him. And as this internal collapse accelerated, the final, fatal blow would come not from the west, but from the east. While the Amorites are carving up the western provinces of the crumbling empire, and the salty fields are refusing to grow, the last king of Ur-Ibisin looks to his eastern border with growing dread. Here, across the Tigris River, in the foothills and plains of what is now southwestern Iran, lies the ancient kingdom of Elam. Elam and Sumer have a long and complicated history. They are old neighbors, old trading partners, and very old enemies. You are a scout on the eastern frontier, huddled on a dusty ridge overlooking the plains of Elam. Its capital city, Susa, is a formidable center of power in its own right, with a culture as old and as proud as Sumer's. For much of the UR3 period, Elam had been a vassal state, controlled and dominated by the powerful Sumerian kings. Shulgi had married one of his daughters to the governor of Anshan, a major Elamite city, a classic political move to secure the frontier. But the Elamites chafed under Sumerian rule. They were not some barbaric tribe like the Gudians. They were a sophisticated civilization with their own language, which is also a linguistic isolate, like Sumerian, their own gods, and their own ambitions. As the empire of Ur began to tremble, the Elamites saw their opportunity for revenge and independence. They broke away from Sumerian control and began to consolidate their power under a newly assertive dynasty, the dynasty of Shamashki. They started launching their own raids across the Tigris, testing the defenses of the weakened Sumerian state. Ibisin, the king in Ur, managed to lead a campaign against them early in his reign and even captured the Elamite ruler. But it was a temporary victory. He couldn't afford to station a large army permanently on the eastern front while the west was collapsing into the hands of the Amorites. He was fighting a war on two fronts and losing both. The situation becomes desperate. The city of Ur is now an island of tenuous authority in a sea of chaos. Its food supplies have been cut off by the Amorite warlord Ishbaera to the north. The state's granaries are empty. Famine grips the capital. The price of grain skyrockets to 60 times its normal price, a clear sign of total economic collapse recorded on tablets from the period. This is a mainstream historical fact that paints a grim picture of a city under siege, starving from the inside out. Ibisen sends desperate letters to his rogue general Ishbaera, pleading with him to send the grain he was entrusted with. But Ishbaera, smelling the end, refuses. The Elamites, likely in a coalition with other tribal groups from the Zagros Mountains, see that the time is right for a final, decisive blow. They muster a great army and march on the Sumerian heartland. Their target is not just plunder. It is the destruction of the symbol of Sumerian oppression, the capital city of Ur itself. They sweep across the plains, meeting little effective resistance. The once mighty army of Ur is now a shadow of its former self, demoralized and depleted. The Elamites reach the great city of Ur, the very city whose founder, Ur-Nammu, had built its magnificent ziggurat as a symbol of eternal power. The city whose scribes had perfected the art of bureaucracy. The city that had been the capital of the known world. And in the year 2004 BC, a date that marks the definitive end of the Sumerian age, the Elamite army smashes through its defenses. The sack of Ur was a traumatic event that seared itself into the memory of Mesopotamia for centuries. It wasn't just a conquest. It was a brutal, destructive rampage. The invaders showed no mercy. They looted the great temples, stripping them of their treasures, the gold, silver, and lapis lazuli that had been accumulated over generations. They set fire to the sacred buildings, the palaces, and the homes of the ordinary citizens. The city that was the center of order and civilization was plunged into a nightmare of violence and chaos. A quirky but poignant archaeological find gives a human face to this destruction. In the ruins of a house from this period, archaeologists found the skeletons of a small family, huddled together in a corner, crushed by the collapsing, burning roof of their own home. It's a silent, tragic snapshot of the human cost of the city's fall. The invaders captured the last king, Ibisen, and dragged him away in chains to Elam, where he would die in exile. The third dynasty of Ur was over. Historians still debate the precise level of coordination between the Elamites and the Amorites. Did Ishbaera, the Amorite general, have a secret alliance with the Elamites? Did he deliberately weaken Ur to pave the way for their invasion, so he could then pick up the pieces? There's no smoking gun tablet that proves a conspiracy, but the timing is certainly suspicious. Ishbaera did nothing to help Ur in its final hour. Once the Elamites had sacked the city and retreated with their loot, he conveniently marched his own troops into the southern cities, including the ruined Ur, and established himself as the heir to the defunct kingdom. The fall of Ur was more than just a military defeat. It was a psychological blow from which Sumerian culture would never recover. The destruction of the holy city, the seat of kingship, was an event of cosmic horror. It meant the gods had well and truly abandoned them. And in the aftermath of this catastrophe, the survivors would try to make sense of it the only way they knew how, through poetry. They would write a new kind of literature, a literature of grief, to mourn their lost world. The smoke has cleared over the ruins of Ur. The Elamite warbands have retreated back to the mountains, their mules laden with the treasures of the world's richest city. What's left behind is a scene of utter desolation. You are a survivor, picking your way through the rubble of what was once your home. The great ziggurat still stands, scarred and silent, but the temple at its base is a burned-out shell. The narrow streets are choked with collapsed walls and charred timbers. The silence is the most terrifying thing. The bustling noise of the capital, the merchants' cries, the temple chants, the scribes' chatter, has been replaced by the whisper of the wind through the ruins and the soft sobbing of other survivors. This is the end of the Sumerian world as a political entity. The year 2004 BC is the historical tombstone. There will never again be a great, unified kingdom ruled by Sumerians and speaking the Sumerian language. Power has now passed to the Amorite kings like Ishbaera, who will build new dynasties in cities like Isin, Larsa, and most famously Babylon. The political focus of Mesopotamia will shift permanently northwards. The old Sumerian south, with its salty soil and ruined cities, is now a backwater. But how do you process a catastrophe of this magnitude? How does a culture deal with the death of its entire world? The Sumerian survivors, and their Akkadian-speaking successors, did it through literature. In the century following the fall of Ur, a new genre of poetry emerged, the city lament. These are some of the most powerful and moving works to come down to us from the ancient world. They are long, poetic compositions that mourn the destruction of the great Sumerian cities, especially Ur. The most famous of these is the Lament for Ur. It's a work of profound grief and theological anguish. You are sitting in a scribal school in the city of Nippur, a generation after the fall, copying the words of the lament. The poem is written as a dialogue, primarily a desperate plea from the goddess Ningal, the patron deity and divine wife of the moon god of Ur. She weeps for her city, her house, and her people. She describes how she begged and pleaded with the council of the great gods, with En and Enlil, to spare her city, but they refused. The decision was made. Ur must be destroyed. The imagery is vivid and heartbreaking. The lament speaks of a terrible storm, sent by the god Enlil, that overwhelms the land. This is likely a poetic metaphor for the Elamite invasion, but it's described with the force of a natural disaster, the storm that annihilates the land. It is roaring above. It speaks of the aftermath in stark terms. In its streets where the feasting crowds would stroll, dead bodies were lying about. In its boulevards where the festivities were held, heads were lying about. The blood of the country, like a heavy bronze, filled all the holes. It's a raw, unflinching look at the horror of the city's destruction. The poem is a national trauma processed into art. This is a mainstream historical fact. These laments were composed and copied by scribes for centuries after the event itself. They became part of the standard curriculum. Every educated scribe had to learn and understand the story of the great disaster. It was the foundational tragedy of their cultural memory, much like the fall of Troy for the ancient Greeks or the destruction of the temple for the ancient Jews. But these laments are more than just sad poems. They are also sophisticated works of theology, trying to answer the terrible question, why? Why did our gods abandon us? The answer the poets arrive at is not simple. It wasn't because the people of Ur had committed a specific, terrible sin. The lament for Ur makes it clear that the goddess Ningal sees the destruction as unjust. The ultimate reason is far more chilling. It was simply the will of the divine council. The gods, in their inscrutable wisdom, had decreed that the term of Ur's kingship had come to an end. It's a fatalistic and terrifying worldview. The gods can giveth, and the gods can taketh away, and you don't always get to know the reason why. Historians still debate the primary purpose of these laments. Were they simply expressions of historical grief, or were they political documents, perhaps composed by the new Amorite kings to legitimize their own rule? By sponsoring the telling of this story, they could position themselves as the rightful successors, the ones who would bring order back to the chaos left by the Elamites and the failed Sumerian kings. Yes, the old dynasty fell, the poems implicitly say, but that was the will of the gods. Now a new era begins. A quirky and fascinating detail is how personal the grief feels in the poem. The goddess Ningal doesn't just weep for her temple. She weeps for the details of her home. She cries out for her storehouse, her treasury, and even the reeds in the marsh, that now grow wild. But most poignantly, she acts like a human mother searching for her lost children in the aftermath of a massacre. "O my city, I will set up a whale for you. My heart, a timid bird, has flown from its nest and fled." The poem makes the goddess a refugee, just like her people. It's a powerful emotional tool that would have resonated deeply with an audience for whom the memory of the collapse was still fresh and raw. The city was dead, the last king was gone, but in these haunting words, the spirit of Sumer found a different kind of immortality, the immortality of a story well told. The political story of Sumer is over. The last Sumerian king is dead or exiled. The great cities are in ruins or ruled by Amorite foreigners. The Sumerian language is no longer spoken in the streets or marketplaces. It's being replaced by Akkadian, the language of Sargon, and the various dialects of the newly arrived Amorites. So, in the aftermath of the collapse, as we sift through the rubble of their civilization, a fundamental question arises. Who exactly were these people who invented nearly everything? Where did they come from? This question brings us to one of the most intriguing and enduring mysteries in all of linguistics and ancient history, the Sumerian language itself. You are a linguist in the 19th century. You've successfully deciphered Akkadian cuneiform because it's a Semitic language, related to others you know, like Hebrew and Arabic. But as you dig deeper, you find these older tablets, written in a version of cuneiform that doesn't follow any of the rules of Semitic grammar. The vocabulary is utterly alien. The structure is bizarre. You have discovered Sumerian, and it makes no sense. Sumerian is what we call a language isolate. This is a mainstream linguistic fact of profound importance. A language isolate is a language with no demonstrable genetic relationship to any other known language, living or dead. It is an orphan tongue. While most languages in Europe and the Near East belong to large families like Indo-European, English, Russian, Hindi, or Afro-Asiatic, Arabic, Hebrew, Ancient Egyptian, Sumerian stands utterly alone. This is incredibly strange. Languages don't normally pop into existence out of nowhere. They evolve. They have ancestors. They have cousins. But Sumerian does not. This has led to a century and a half of intense scholarly debate and, frankly, a lot of wild speculation about the origins of the Sumerian people. If their language is unrelated to any of their neighbors, does that mean they were outsiders who migrated into Mesopotamia at some point in the distant past? This is the prevailing theory, but it begs the question, where did they come from? Scholars have proposed almost every conceivable homeland. Some have suggested they came from the east, from the region of Iran or even the Indus Valley, pointing to some vague similarities in early pottery styles. Others have suggested they came by sea, from the land of Dilmun, modern Bahrain, in the Persian Gulf, which features in their myths as a kind of pristine paradise. Still others have argued they came from the north, from the Caucasus region. The problem is, there is no definitive archaeological or linguistic evidence to support any of these theories over the others. The Sumerians' own myths are no help. They believed they were created in their land, the Eden, the plain, by the gods. They have no tradition of migrating from somewhere else. This has led to a competing theory, that the Sumerians were, in fact, the indigenous people of southern Mesopotamia, and their language is an isolate simply because all of its ancient relatives died out before they could ever be recorded. In this view, the linguistic landscape of the ancient Near East was once much more diverse, and what we see today are just the winners, the big language families that expanded and wiped out all the others. The Sumerians, in this scenario, are the last speakers of a lost linguistic world. The language itself is fascinatingly strange to speakers of Indo-European or Semitic languages. It's an agglutinative language. That means it constructs words by gluing together a long string of prefixes, suffixes, and infixes to a central root. A single Sumerian word can express what would take an entire sentence in English. For example, the verb munitume translates as, when he had made it suitable for her. All that information is packed into one complex word. This structure makes it very different from the languages around it, and is one of the reasons it's so hard to be sure it's not related to anything else. Over the years, this mystery has attracted a lot of quirky and fringe theories. Because it's an isolate, it has become a magnet for people trying to connect it to other mysterious, isolated languages. The most famous of these attempts is the effort to link Sumerian to the Hungarian language, part of the Finno-Ugric family. This is a popular theory in Hungarian nationalist circles, but has been almost universally rejected by mainstream linguists. The similarities are based on cherry-picked words and ignore the fundamental differences in grammar and sound systems. Other amateur linguists have tried to connect Sumerian to Basque, to various languages of the Caucasus, and even to some Native American tongues. None of these theories have held up to rigorous scientific scrutiny. For now, Sumerian remains defiantly, stubbornly alone. So, while we can describe their society, their religion, and their history in great detail, the fundamental question of their ethnic and linguistic origins remains a frustrating blank space. They are a people defined not by their blood or their origins, but by their accomplishments. They are the people who lived between the rivers, who built the first cities, and who first etched their thoughts onto clay. Their identity is not in their point of origin, but in the civilization they created. And while their language would die out on the streets, and their political power was now gone forever, their ideas were about to prove far more durable than their cities. The Sumerians as a people had disappeared, but their ghost was about to possess the soul of every civilization that followed. The city of Ur is a ruin. The Sumerian language is a ghost, haunting the corridors of scribal schools. The Sumerian people have vanished, absorbed into the tidal wave of Amorite and other Semitic peoples who now control Mesopotamia. By all traditional metrics, the civilization is dead. But this is where the story gets strange. Because Sumer didn't really die. It was murdered, yes, but then its ghost possessed its killers. Sumerian culture underwent a strange and powerful afterlife, becoming the essential software on which all subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations would run. You are a young student in a scribal school in the city of Babylon, perhaps 200 years after the fall of Ur. The king of Babylon is a powerful Amorite ruler named Hammurabi. The language you speak with your friends in the courtyard is a dialect of Akkadian. But when you go into the classroom, the Dubba, your lessons are in Sumerian. You spend your days painstakingly copying out ancient Sumerian texts. You learn the Sumerian language, not because anyone speaks it, but because it is the language of culture, religion, law, and science. It is the classical language, the key to all ancient wisdom. To be an educated person in Babylon is to know Sumerian. The Amorite kings, like Hammurabi, who were now ruling Mesopotamia, had no intention of erasing the culture of the land they had conquered. On the contrary, they sought to wrap themselves in its legitimacy. They adopted the titles of the old Sumerian and Akkadian kings. They worshipped the Sumerian gods, although they elevated their own patron deity, Marduk of Babylon, to the head of the pantheon. To do this, they had their scribes compose a new creation epic, the Enuma Elish, which cleverly rewrote the cosmic story to justify Marduk's supremacy over the older gods like Enlil. It was a theological hostile takeover. This process of cultural absorption is the great, central fact of post-Sumerian history. The conquerors were conquered by the culture of the defeated. We see it everywhere. The laws of Hammurabi's famous code, while written in Akkadian, are clearly based on the legal principles, and even the structure of earlier Sumerian law codes like that of Ur-Nammu. The science of the Babylonians, their sophisticated astronomy and mathematics, was built directly on the foundations laid by the Sumerians, right down to the use of the base 60 system. The Babylonians became masters of astronomy, creating detailed star charts and developing the ability to predict eclipses. But they were looking at the stars to understand the will of the same gods the Sumerians had worshipped thousands of years before. The old Sumerian myths and legends were copied, translated, and adapted. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which began as a cycle of separate Sumerian poems about the king of Uruk, was woven together and expanded by Babylonian scribes into the single, unified epic we know today. It's in this later Babylonian version that the famous flood story, with its hero Utnapishtim, is added to the narrative, borrowing heavily from the much older Sumerian flood myth of Ziusadra. The ghost of Sumer was the creative engine of Babylon. Historians still debate the depth of this cultural continuity. Was Babylonian culture just a thin veneer of Akkadian language over a purely Sumerian core? Or was it a genuine synthesis, a new and vibrant culture that creatively transformed the Sumerian inheritance into something new? The consensus leans towards the latter. The Babylonians, and later the Assyrians, were not just passive imitators. They were active participants in a living tradition, adding their own innovations, their own perspectives, and their own new literary and artistic masterpieces. But the fundamental operating system, the cuneiform script, the pantheon of gods, the legal concepts, the scientific framework, was undeniably Sumerian in origin. A quirky and fascinating example of this cultural haunting is the persistence of Sumerian proverbs and wisdom literature. Babylonian scribes loved to collect and copy lists of old Sumerian sayings. These give us a wonderful, intimate glimpse into their worldview. Some of them are surprisingly modern and cynical. The poor man is better dead than alive. Others are timelessly practical. Friendship lasts a day. Kinship lasts forever. And some are just plain funny, revealing a dry, sarcastic wit. You go and carry off the enemy's land. The enemy comes and carries off your land. My personal favorite, which feels like it could have been written yesterday, is something which has never occurred since time immemorial. A young woman did not fart in her husband's lap. This earthy, human, and slightly sarcastic voice echoed down through the centuries, a direct link to the way ordinary Sumerians saw their world. This cultural transmission is the reason we know anything about the Sumerians at all. The Babylonian and Assyrian scribes who so painstakingly copied their texts became the unlikely curators of a dead civilization's memory. When archaeologists in the 19th century unearthed the great library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, they found not just Assyrian records, but thousands of tablets that were copies of ancient Sumerian and Babylonian works. It was a library of ghosts. Without this obsessive preservation by their cultural descendants, the Sumerians might have remained lost forever. They disappeared as a people, only to become a permanent and essential part of the intellectual DNA of the ancient Near East. Their collapse was total, yet their victory was, in a strange way, absolute. But this still leaves us with the ultimate question. What was the final trigger? What pushed this complex system, with all its internal flaws, over the final edge? We've followed the story of the Sumerians from their miraculous beginnings to their tragic end. We've seen the internal causes of their decline, the constant, grinding warfare between the city-states, the ecological suicide of soil salinization, the crushing weight of a top-heavy bureaucracy, the internal bleeding from Amorite infiltration, and the final, brutal invasion by the Elamites. For most of history, that's where the explanation ended. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, a story of political, social, and economic failure. But in recent decades, a new suspect has entered the courtroom of history, a culprit so large and so powerful that it may have been the primary cause that triggered all the others. This is the 4.2 kilo-year climate event. Let's step back from the clay tablets and the royal inscriptions and look at a different kind of evidence. You are a climatologist drilling a core sample from a glacier in the Himalayas. You are analyzing the sediment layers at the bottom of a lake in Oman. You are studying the chemical composition of stalagmites in a cave in Iran. From all these different, independent sources around the world, a consistent story emerges. Right around 2200 BC, something dramatic happens to the global climate. The evidence points to a sudden, severe, and widespread megadrought that lasted for 2 to 3 centuries. This wasn't just a dry spell. It was a fundamental shift in atmospheric patterns. The leading theory is that a sudden cooling of North Atlantic sea surface temperatures weakened the monsoon systems that bring vital summer rains to vast swathes of Africa and Asia. The effects were global, but they were particularly devastating in the Middle East. This is the mainstream scientific consensus behind the 4.2K event. It was a genuine climate catastrophe, one of the most significant to affect human civilization since the end of the last ice age. Now, let's place this event on our historical timeline. The date, 2200 BC, is startling. It coincides almost perfectly with the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. Remember the Curse of Akkad, with its haunting description of a land where the fields grew no grain and the cloud of dust never settled? What was once seen as poetic metaphor now looks chillingly like a historical account of a real environmental disaster. The drought would have decimated the rain-fed agriculture of the northern Akkadian heartland, leading to famine, the abandonment of cities, and creating a wave of climate refugees moving south, a pattern we see in the archaeological record. It also explains the barbarian invasions. The Gutians from the Zagros Mountains and the Amorites from the Syrian steppe were not necessarily evil marauders. They were likely desperate peoples whose own grazing lands had turned to dust, forcing them down into the irrigated river valleys in search of survival. The great scholarly debate today is not if the 4.2K event happened, but how central it was to the collapses we see across the ancient world. It wasn't just the Akkadian Empire that fell. Around the same time, the Old Kingdom in Egypt collapsed into its first intermediate period, a time of chaos and civil war. Early civilizations in the Aegean and the Indus Valley also show signs of crisis and urban decline. Was this all a coincidence, or was the megadrought the common thread, the domino that toppled civilizations across the hemisphere? For Sumer, the story is a little more complex. The third dynasty of Ur, the Great Sumerian Renaissance, actually rose to power after the initial onset of the drought. This seems counterintuitive, but the Sumerian South, with its irrigation-based agriculture, may have been better insulated from the immediate effects of the drought than the rain-fed North. In fact, the initial chaos might have helped them. The collapse of the northern powers allowed Ur to reassert its independence and build its empire. It's a quirky historical irony. The climate event that helped kill the Akkadian Empire may have created the conditions for Sumer's last gasp of glory, but they couldn't outrun the climate forever. While they could still draw water from the Tigris and Euphrates, the rivers themselves would have been affected. A centuries-long drought in the Anatolian highlands, where the rivers have their source, would have meant a significant reduction in their overall flow. This would have made irrigation more difficult and would have concentrated the deadly salts even further. The slow poison of salinization would have been accelerated by the drought. The environmental crisis that was already crippling their agriculture was likely pushed into overdrive by the broader climate shift. So, when we look at the final collapse of Ur around 2004 BC, we see a civilization that was not just dealing with its own self-inflicted wounds. It was a civilization already on its knees, being pummeled by a force of nature it couldn't possibly understand. The reduced river flow would have intensified the competition for water, making conflicts with neighbors more likely. The crop failures would have made it impossible to feed the bureaucracy and the army, leading to the internal breakdown that allowed the Amorites to gain a foothold. The famine in the capital would have made it impossible to withstand the final Elamite siege. The 4.2-kilo-year event, therefore, acts as a great unifying theory for the disappearance of the Sumerians. It's the why now that connects all the other causes. It links the fall of Akkad with the crisis of Ur. It transforms the barbarian invaders from simple villains into desperate actors in a much larger climate drama. It provides a powerful physical explanation for the agricultural collapse that we see so clearly in the textual records. The Sumerians didn't just disappear because of politics or economics. They disappeared, in large part, because the sky failed them. The rain stopped, the rivers shrank, and the delicate, man-made paradise they had built over 3 millennia withered under a hostile sun. It's a sobering reminder that any civilization, no matter how brilliant, is ultimately built on a fragile foundation of climate stability. For nearly 4,000 years after the fall of Ur, the Sumerians slumbered in total obscurity. Their language was forgotten, their cities buried, their very name erased from human memory. The great civilizations that followed, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, knew of Babylon and Assyria from texts and traditions. But the originators, the people who had started it all, were completely unknown. The story of their rediscovery is an intellectual adventure story in its own right, a tale of 19th-century explorers, obsessive scholars, and the slow, patient work of the archaeologist Spade. The journey begins not in the deserts of Iraq, but in the libraries and studies of Europe. You are a European scholar in the early 1800s. The ancient Near East is a land of myth and legend, known primarily through the accounts of the Bible and classical Greek historians like Herodotus. It's a place of Assyrian warlords and Babylonian kings, of the Tower of Babel and the Hanging Gardens. Intrepid and often eccentric European travelers begin to venture into the Ottoman-controlled territories of Mesopotamia, searching for the physical remains of these legendary places. One of the first key figures is Claudius Rich, a British resident for the East India Company in Baghdad. In the 1810s and 20s, he meticulously surveyed and mapped the ruins of Babylon and Nineveh, collecting artifacts, including clay tablets covered in the strange, wedge-shaped cuneiform script. His work sparked a wave of European interest. By the 1840s, the age of Mesopotamian archaeology had begun in earnest, led by two colorful and fiercely competitive rivals, the Frenchman Paul-Émile Botta and the Englishman Austin Henry Layard. These early excavations were less like scientific investigations and more like treasure hunts. Botta and Layard employed huge teams of local workmen to dig massive, unsystematic trenches and tunnels into the great mounds, searching for monumental sculptures and museum-worthy artifacts to ship back to the Louvre in Paris and the British Museum in London. And they found them. They unearthed colossal winged bulls, magnificent carved reliefs depicting royal lion hunts and brutal military campaigns. They had found the palaces of the great Assyrian kings. This was a stunning confirmation of the historical reality of the biblical accounts. This is the mainstream historical narrative of the rediscovery. It was a quest to prove the Bible, which led to the unearthing of Assyria and Babylon. But as they dug, they found not just sculptures, but tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets. The race was now on to decipher the script. The breakthrough came thanks to the work of several brilliant scholars, most notably Henry Rawlinson, an adventurous British Army officer. The key was a massive inscription carved on a cliff face at Behistun, in modern Iran. The inscription was trilingual, written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian Akkadian, a Mesopotamian Rosetta Stone. By deciphering the known Old Persian, Rawlinson and others were able to crack the code of Akkadian. Now they could read the tablets. They could read the annals of the Assyrian kings, the laws of Hammurabi, the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was a revolution in historical knowledge. But as they translated more and more texts from the libraries, especially those from southern Mesopotamia, they began to notice something strange. Some tablets were written with syllabic signs that spelled out the Semitic Akkadian language, but many others used logograms, where one sign stood for a whole word. They also found bilingual tablets, like dictionaries, with a column of words in Akkadian next to a column of words in a completely unknown, non-Semitic language. Scholars at first refused to believe it. They thought this other language was just a secret, ceremonial code, or a strange way of writing Akkadian. The man who championed the idea of a separate, older, non-Semitic language was a scholar named Jules Oppert. In 1869, he proposed that these people should be called Sumerians, based on the royal title King of Sumer and Akkad. For a long time, his theory was highly controversial. The debate over the existence of the Sumerians became a bitter academic feud. Was there really a mysterious, forgotten civilization that predated the Babylonians, or was it a scholarly fantasy? The final proof came from the dirt. In the late 1870s, French archaeologists began excavations at the site of Tel Loh, the ancient city of Girsu. There, deep beneath the layers associated with the Babylonians, they found statues and inscriptions of rulers like Gediah of Lagash, written in pure, unadulterated Sumerian. There was no Akkadian translation. These were the artifacts of a people who had lived and ruled long before Babylon was a major power. The Sumerians were real. This discovery opened the floodgates. Over the next several decades, international teams of archaeologists began excavating the great Sumerian sites. Nippur, the holy city; Uruk, the first metropolis; and most famously, Ur, led by the British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 30s. Woolley's excavation of the royal tombs of Ur was a global sensation. He uncovered treasures of gold, lapis lazuli, and carnelian that rivaled the tomb of Tutankhamun in Egypt. He found a ram in a thicket statue, the standard of Ur, and the exquisite golden headdresses of a queen named Pwabi. It was a quirky and slightly morbid discovery that brought the rich, lost world of the Sumerians to life in the popular imagination. So, after 4 millennia of silence, the Sumerians re-entered human history. Their rediscovery was a slow, piecemeal process, a puzzle assembled by generations of scholars and archaeologists. And as the puzzle came together, it became clear that they were not just another ancient people. They were the people who had laid the foundations for everything that came after. The mystery of their disappearance was finally matched by the wonder of their rediscovery. And the final piece of the puzzle was realizing just how much of their world was still secretly alive in our own, that we've reached the end of our journey. We have stood in the dust of a forgotten land, witnessed the birth of the city, decoded the first writing, and watched a brilliant civilization rise, fall, and vanish from memory. We've untangled the complex web of causes for their disappearance: the salty earth, the endless wars, the bureaucratic rot, the foreign invaders, and the final, devastating blow from a changing climate. We have, in essence, attended a 5,000-year-old funeral. But the strange thing about Sumer is that its ghosts never really left us. You might think their world is impossibly distant, a fossilized curiosity with no relevance to your life as you lie here, listening in the 21st century. You would be wrong. The Sumerians are hidden in the background of your daily life, silent partners in the way you perceive the world. Their legacy is so foundational that it has become invisible, like the operating system running quietly in the background of your phone. Every time you glance at a clock, you are seeing the world through Sumerian eyes. That circular face, divided into 12 hours for the day and 12 for the night, and the division of each of those hours into 60 minutes, and each of those minutes into 60 seconds. That is a direct, unbroken line of intellectual inheritance from the base, 60 mathematical system developed in the temples of Uruk to count sheep and barley. They built a cage of time for you, and you are living in it. When you sign a contract, buy a house, or even just agree to a terms and conditions pop-up. You are participating in a tradition that began with Sumerian legal codes. The idea that a society should be governed by written, publicly known laws that apply to everyone. The principle that the strong should not be allowed to oppress the weak. These are the ideals first articulated in the prologue to the Code of Uarnamu. Your legal system has its deepest roots in the Sumerian attempt to create order and justice in a complex urban society. This is the most profound historical fact about the Sumerians. Their inventions were so good, so fundamental, that they were adopted, adapted, and passed down by every subsequent civilization, spreading like a cultural virus until they became part of the common heritage of humanity. The Babylonians took their science, the Hebrews took their flood story, the Greeks took their early astronomical observations, the Romans took their legal concepts, and on, through the Arabs and into medieval Europe, until their ideas landed here, with you. Even the way we structure our stories owes a debt to them. The hero's journey, the epic quest, the confrontation with mortality, the flawed hero who challenges the gods. These are the themes first explored in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the tale of a king terrified of his own death, who goes on a quest for eternal life, only to learn that a mortal's true immortality lies in the things they build and the stories they leave behind. Is a narrative arc that has been endlessly repeated in literature and film for 4,000 years. The scholarly debate continues over just how much of our world can be traced back to them. Did they invent religion, or just the first organized form of it? Was their science true science, or just a form of magical record-keeping? But these debates can sometimes miss the forest for the trees. The crucial point is that they were the first to systematically write it all down. They created the template. They built the first city, and in doing so, created all the problems of urban life that we still grapple with today. Social inequality, bureaucracy, crime, and how to live peacefully with thousands of strangers. And they created the first solutions, laws, government, and administration. And what about the quirky personal echoes? Think about your horoscope. The division of the sky into 12 zodiacal constellations, which the Greeks would later name and popularize, has its ultimate origin in the sky-watching practices of Mesopotamian priests, who believed the movements of the planets were omens from the gods. Think about enjoying a cold beer after a long week. You are participating in a ritual that a Sumerian worker, paid in beer from a bevel-rimmed bowl, would have understood perfectly. So the Sumerians did disappear. As a distinct people, speaking their own strange, lonely language, they were erased by time, conquest, and climate. Their bloodline was absorbed, their language died, their cities turned to dust. But they achieved a different kind of survival. They disappeared into everything. They became the foundational layer of civilization, the bricks in the basement of the world. They are the ghost in our machine. Their story is a powerful, humbling reminder. It shows us that even the most brilliant and innovative societies are fragile, vulnerable to the slow poison of environmental change and the sudden shock of social collapse. But it also shows us that ideas can be more resilient than empires, and that a story, written on a humble piece of clay, can grant a kind of immortality that even the god king Gilgamesh could never find. The Sumerians are gone, but they are also, in a very real sense, everywhere. The story of the Sumerians, of their rise and their slow, lingering fall, is more than just a history lesson. It is a quiet echo in the chambers of your own world. Their triumphs and their failures are woven into the very fabric of how we live, how we measure our days, and how we tell our stories. The same forces that undid them, the delicate balance between humanity and the environment, the tensions between neighboring powers, the challenge of managing complex societies, are the same forces that shape our headlines today. Their world of mud brick and reed houses may seem distant, but their struggles were deeply, fundamentally human. As you begin to drift now, Let the images of their world fade gently. Picture the green fields giving way to the white crust of salt, the bustling streets of Uruk falling silent, the last scribe etching the last lament onto a piece of clay. Their civilization is now just a layer of dust in a far-off land, a story whispered on the wind. But it is a story that has found its way here, to you, across the immense ocean of time. Their legacy is a soft hum in the background of your own life, a reminder that we are all just building on the foundations of those who came before. Let the silence of their lost cities become a peaceful quiet in your own mind. Let the great river of time carry you now into the gentle currents of your own deep and restful sleep. What truly happened to the first great civilization on Earth? In this final chapter, we uncover the shocking truth behind the fall of the Sumerians, a people who invented writing, built the first cities, and worshipped gods that may not have been of this world. But then they vanished. Their cities were abandoned, their language lost. Was it war, famine, or something far more terrifying? This episode dives deep into ancient texts, forbidden archaeology, and clues buried beneath the sands of time. What secret did the Sumerians know that sealed their fate? Watch until the end. The final twist may rewrite everything we thought we knew about human history.